Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for This View of Life, the online evolution magazine. And I'm very happy to be talking with Alexander Stewart and Joshua Plotkin from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, gentlemen.
Nice to be here. Nice to be here. Yep.
And I want to talk about the evolution of cooperation based on a recent article that you have in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences titled From Extortion to Generosity, Evolution in the Iterated Prisoner's Dilemma. And this topic goes back a long way. It's a kind of classic problem of cooperation and defection played out in this kind of social microcosm of two-person prisoner's dilemma games. And could I ask you to begin with a little bit of background on the history of this game, bringing us up to the present, your paper, which is based on a previous paper by Preston Dyson. Could you just give me a kind of an encapsulated history to the best of your ability?
Okay, sure. So the prisoner's dilemma has been around since, I guess, the 1950s, when it was developed or invented, whatever you want to call it, by the Rand Corporation. And it's a way of abstractly capturing what I think is kind of a common problem in social interactions, which is that if you have two players playing a game or two people interacting with each other and they have two options, they can choose to cooperate with one another or defect. If they choose to cooperate with one another, then they both receive some payoff in the language of game theory, and if one defects and the other cooperates, the guy who defects gets a higher payoff than they would if they chose to cooperate. But if they both defect, they both get a very low payoff. So it's this idea: cooperation is good for both if both do it, but you can do better by screwing someone over.
Right, keep going.
And then, so it's kind of an interesting question: when should rational players choose to cooperate? And as it was originally formulated, the answer is they shouldn't. If you just play it once, if you and I just play the prisoner's dilemma one time, we should both defect. That's the Nash equilibrium. And so that's kind of a depressing view of the prospects for for cooperation amongst rational people.
By rational, you mean people that are trying to maximize their own payoff, right?
Exactly. Yes. Right. Exactly.
At least, yeah, and their absolute payoff, actually. Yeah.
Right.
Right, and so good. So continue.
Okay, so then Axelrod and Hamilton started to look at tournaments of players playing the prisoner's dilemma, all using different strategies and playing against each other in turn in a round-robin tournament. And what they found was that...
And even by then, though, they were looking at the iterated prisoner's dilemma.
It's kind of the iterated prisoner's. I think that the way it works is that you just... I might be wrong, but I think the way it works is that you just play each other one time, but you play many people or something.
Okay. Well, actually, let's, again, this is going to be, in part, a tutorial. So we have a one-shot prisoner's dilemma where two players meet exactly once. And then we have an iterated prisoner's dilemma in which the same players play a number of times.
Right.
Which in turn can be a variable length. It could have a fixed length. It could be a probability of final interaction. So there's many, many permutations of this game. But the distinction between a one-shot prisoner's dilemma and an iterated prisoner's dilemma is a key variable, right?
Right, exactly.
That's right, in the sense that, as Alex said, the outcome in the one-shot game is fairly clear and straightforward, I guess, at least in retrospect. Whereas in the iterated game, even in its simplest incarnation, where we just simply iterate playing an infinite number of rounds, assuredly, of this game, the space of possible strategies is very large, because I might choose to cooperate or defect in any given round based on all of the history of our previous interactions.
Right.
And I could be sort of very calculating in my choice if I wanted to be.
Right, so there's only two choices at any one play, but there's almost an infinite number of possibilities in terms of the combination of those choices.
That's right, in the sense that I could have a very long memory of our prior interactions and make my choice this round based on everything that happened previously in principle. Right. And when it becomes iterated like that, it's not quite as clear what strategy is best. It's and there might now all of a sudden be prospects for cooperation or cooperative-like strategies to emerge.
Yeah, now let's also get the distinction between classical game theory and evolutionary game theory on the table. So that distinction is?
Great, thanks, because that's indeed the distinction in many ways between Preston Dyson's sort of groundbreaking work a year ago and the sort of small add-on paper we've done subsequently. Preston Dyson's paper was very much a paper in classical game theory where they imagined just two players, two opponents, who come together and they play this infinitely repeated game, but they play it against each other alone. And there's no other players involved, and the question is what strategies do well in this set of just two players. Whereas in evolutionary game theory, which is, I guess, a field developed in the 80s a lot.
I think it was in the 70s.
In the 70s before as well. There's a whole population of players who, in successive rounds, each of them plays all others, and depending upon their total score, get to reproduce more often than others, and thereby leave a greater proportion of their strategy in subsequent generations than others. And so, loosely speaking, the evolutionary setting is a n bigger than 2 population, and the classical setting is an n equal 2 population.
Yeah, just repeat that for me, what you just said.
Just that in the evolutionary setting, in evolutionary game theory, which was not, again, the main question in Preston Dyson's paper, strategies, players hold strategies, they play against everyone else in the population, and depending upon how well they fare against everyone else, they get to reproduce more or less in subsequent generations. And so the frequencies of all of the different strategies in the population change over time according to the standard Darwinian principle that those strategies that have fared well get to have more offspring who inherit their strategy.
Right, but in the evolutionary game theory, the social interactions are still in pairs, but there's now many pairs in a population, and
that's exactly right. At least in this, that's exactly right. At least in our paper, people play pairwise, but they sum up their score across all of the pairwise interactions, and their summed score against all pairs determines their reproductive output.
Right, right. And so I'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, awesome, great. And so now against that background, let's discuss the Preston Dyson result.
Sure. You want me to take it?
Go for it, yeah.
Okay, so I think Preston Dyson really had quite a shocking advance in the sense that their paper is very much, as you said, a paper in classical game theory, just a single pair of players playing this infinitely repeated prisoner's dilemma game. And in that sense, really everything that they did could have been done as early as the 50s. It didn't really require this concept of evolutionary game theory, despite the word evolution in their title, perhaps. They considered a pair of players, and they discovered that there are strategies, a fairly large space of strategies, actually, in this iterated prisoner's dilemma game, that can do a whole range of things to the benefit of one player who's aware of these strategies. These are so-called zero-determinant strategies that enforce a linear relationship between the two players' long-term scores. And so in particular, amongst these ZD strategies are a subset that, for example, the person aware of these ZD strategies could just set the other person's long-term score and determine the unwitting opponent's long-term score, which is a pretty remarkable result in its own right, although not entirely unknown to game theorists. There's another set of strategies that are ZD, and these are the most exciting ones, that are called extortion strategies, or that Preston Dyson called extortion strategies, that set the ratio of the two players' scores. And so a player who's aware of such strategies and is extorting his opponent can more or less ensure that he will have a larger long-term score than his opponent will, which seems like a very sort of powerful way to dominate the long-term outcome of the game. And this was certainly a surprise that such strategies exist and can be so successful in a two-player setting.
So can you make this familiar? Like if I was the unwitting opponent and you were the extortion ZD strategy, how would you manipulate me?
Well, so the first thing to say is that although in principle I could look at all of our prior interactions, Preston Dyson really made things a lot simpler by noticing I only need to really look at what we each did in the last round, and I can choose whether or not to cooperate or defect this round based on what we did in the last round. And the basic feeling of the extortion strategies, although they've been sort of mathematically defined, is that I'll cooperate with you a good deal of time, but once in a while, for no good reason, I'll just defect to sort of up my payoff. And I'm not sort of, and I'll do this often enough in such a way that I will ensure myself a sort of higher proportion of the scores. Now, it's possible that you could respond by always defecting. And indeed, that's that's sort of the flavor of the extortion strategies. Either we'll both get the mutual defection score, which is a pretty not great score, or if either of us exceeds the mutual defection score, the extortioner is guaranteeing himself a higher proportion of those payoffs. Is that fair? Yeah. Assessment of what extortion is.
I mean, if you're only interested in relative payoff and doing better than your partner, period. Nothing about
that's exactly right, and that's a critical point. That one player dominates the game in the sense that one player, the extortioner, more or less ensures that he will have a higher proportion of scores exceeding the mutual defection score, and the extortioner only cares to sort of win in the sense of having a larger proportion of the scores. Their absolute scores are not controlled by these strategies, and that becomes very important when we start to consider extortion in a large population where the absolute score matters. But in any case, Press and Dyson were, as you said, focused on the relative score, a way to play where one player can sort of be assured of getting a higher score than his opponent, but doesn't really control his absolute score or his opponent's absolute score.
And then also I want to bring out that if someone was playing all defect all the time, there's no way to beat that, right? So the only thing the extortionist could do would be to play all defect, and that would be a rock bottom payoff. But it would be is that right?
Right. So if an extortioner is playing an always defect player, they both end up just always defecting against each other. But an interesting point is that if you were an evolutionary player and I played all D, always defect, your best response to me would be to always defect. That would be how you would maximize your score. But if I play extortion and you're an evolutionary player, then your best response to me is to always cooperate, which is why it's interesting that you have to kind of accede to extortion, whereas that's not true if I was playing all D. So.
And when Alex says evolutionary player, this is a term that was introduced by Press and Dyson, and I think it's maybe not the best term because it has the word evolutionary in it. Press and Dyson imagined a player who's witting of these extortion strategies pitted against another player whom they called an evolutionary player, but which I would call sort of someone who's just trying to maximize their short-term gain, just trying to maximize her own strategy, her own payoff. And in that case, an extortion player pitted against one of these so-called evolutionary opponents, who's sort of a short-sighted maximizer. The evolutionary opponent would like to actually cooperate because the evolutionary player would like to get some payoff, but by doing so, the evolutionary opponent will actually be handing more of the total payoffs to the extortioner, and that's why it's called extortion.
Okay, so that's an idiosyncratic use of the term evolutionary.
Right. That's right. That's not a use of the term that is broad in the literature.
Okay, and so against that background, you have a truly evolutionary model, and how does that go?
Go for it.
Okay, I mean, so I guess what we were interested in was that Press and Dyson have come up with all of these ZD strategies, and what ZD strategies, as Josh explained, allow a player to do is to fix the relationship between the two players' scores. And there's a lot of ways that you can do that. You can play an extortion strategy, but you can also do other stuff. And so the first question we wanted to ask was, well, let's imagine that you just have a population of players in the classic evolutionary setup such that you have n individuals and they each play each other many times and they reproduce according to their payoff. And let's suppose that they're restricted to only play ZD strategies, but they can play any ZD strategy. What would happen?
Now, are these iterated games? So once a pair forms, that they play a number of times?
Right, so these are iterated games in which players play memory 1 ZD strategies, yeah.
And so these games, what's the length of these games?
These games have infinite length in the same way that... So Press and Dyson's results are all originally formulated for infinite length games. You can actually extend it to the case in which you only play the next round with some fixed probability, but that's not what we discuss in our paper, and that's not what Press and Dyson discuss.
Okay. But that's an important point. The games in some sense have infinite length, and then after you finish that one, you play someone else in the population. Right. And then you do it for everyone, and then the whole population sort of reproduces. Yeah. But the fact that it's infinite length in that sense is sort of technical. I mean, it could be that they just specify their strategies and they get their payoff.
So if you wanted to impose a W term, fixed probability, I mean a probability of ending that the results would probably be much the same? Is that the...
We don't know the answer to that exactly, actually, and that's a pretty subtle question. If there's a chance of ending the whole game in any given round, and there's therefore assuredly a finite time horizon, but we don't know exactly when we're going to end playing, I myself certainly don't know exactly how an evolving population would behave. And so we have limited ourselves, at least initially here, to the truly infinitely repeated game.
And this is to make it mathematically tractable for the most part, right?
Right.
That's right.
Okay.
But someone made an interesting point to me the other day that playing a finite number of rounds, not playing an infinite number of rounds in the way that you just described, if the fewer rounds you play, it's kind of like playing in a smaller population. So, but anyway.
Okay.
It's kind of hard to see why that is, I guess. Anyway, never mind. Right, so we looked at an evolution amongst CD strategies in a population playing the Iterated Prisoner's Dilemma an infinite number of times, and what you find is that the ratio between the payoffs that evolves is not extortion, but it's actually the exact opposite end of the scale. It's what we've called generous strategies. And so in contrast to extortion strategies, generous strategies are such that either both players receive the payoff for mutual cooperation, or the player who is playing the generous strategy receives a lower score than their opponent. So it seems like it should be kind of a rubbish thing to do, but
as far as the within-pair comparison, it is a rubbish thing to do, but,
exactly.
but evolutionary game theory adds a new dimension.
Exactly. So yeah, and it's important to note that although generous strategies have this feature that the generous player receives a lower payoff than a defecting opponent, the defecting opponent can never do better than the score for mutual cooperation. They never outcompete the generous strategies in that sense. So yeah, so that was our initial results, and then we sort of expanded it and asked two other questions. One is how do generous ZD strategies do against all other possible memory 1 strategies? And the other is we used some results that have been developed by Aiken, which I think are still on archive. I don't know whether they've been published anywhere else yet. But that allow you to extend the same kind of thinking that Fress and Dyson used to analyze all possible memory 1 strategies in a similar way, in which you just think about the relationships between players' scores without really needing to specify the strategy exactly. And what we found was that so generous strategies that are ZD are able to, or at least a subset of generous strategies that are ZD, are able to resist invasion by any other Prisoner's Dilemma strategy that has memory 1, not just CD strategies, all possible strategies. And what that means is that although you can always find a strategy that does equally well against the generous strategy, is you could just cooperate with it, and then you would both get equal scores, and you could be invaded neutrally,
right?
Meaning with probability, let's say probability replacement 1 over n, where n is the population size. But other than that, no defecting strategy can invade and replace it with probability greater than 1 over n. So in that sense, these strategies are evolutionarily robust. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say, just to summarize that, and it's easier for me to say it because I'm bragging about Alex's results here as opposed to the Congress. But we quantified all of the strategies, all of the cooperative strategies that are robust in the sense that they cannot be selectively invaded by any other iterated Prisoner's Dilemma strategy. And we found that all of the strategies that are robust in this sense are generous. That's to say they will depreciate their own score in response to defection more than they would depreciate their opponent's score. And so that is a very sort of rosy picture of evolution in a well-mixed population, that the strategies that are the only strategies that are evolutionarily robust are always generous strategies. And moreover, we can quantify precisely how generous you have to be in order to be evolutionarily robust. Whoops.
You're good.
Am I still good? Okay.
Yeah.
And it turns out that you can't be the sort of doormat robust. You can't always cooperate, but we can determine in terms of the population size precisely how often you should forgive, that is to say, cooperate even though the other person defected, and how often you should punish, that is to say, defect even if when the last person defected whilst you were cooperating. We can quantify precisely how often you should make those actions in order to be evolutionary robust, so exactly how generous you have to be to remain robust. And so it's a sort of a positive view and sort of a positive turn on this sort of very negative, extortionate two-player result of Press and Dyson, that in fact in a replicating population, and I don't think this is in retrospect all that surprising, it is not the extortion strategies that succeed, but rather these generous strategies, or at least as long as you're not too generous, that succeed.
Right, and I should point out that my previous interview actually for this view of life was with Adam Grant, also at the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School, on his book Give and Take, which is like a real-world equivalent to this, on how giving and taking strategies survive in the workplace, and the idea that the most successful giving strategies are not doormat strategies, but they are smart and protective in a sense. It would be interesting to see how those real-world strategies actually match up with yours. So one point to make is that what you've shown in some mathematically, basically, and so that's important that you can actually demonstrate that this class of generous strategies is most successful mathematically, right? So that as opposed to, for example, a computer simulation result or something.
That's right. It wouldn't have been possible to. It's not really possible by computer simulation to check all possible strategies. It's not really feasible. It was only because we were able to leverage this advance of Press and Dyson, who had derived a linear relationship between the two players' scores, that we were able to make any proofs whatsoever and really prove that the only strategies that are robust are generous. It was because we were using this trick of Press and Dyson and Aiken all throughout. That's sort of the sledgehammer that allowed us to actually make definitive proofs of these results without having to perform computer simulations that aren't really ever completely exhaustive. By the way, it's nice though that you've talked to some people who look at real-world strategies, because, as you said, this is a mathematical result which has certain benefits. We actually know it's true, for example, but it has certain drawbacks in the sense that it's not quite the real world. And what these results mean for the real world is certainly not our domain of expertise, but it would obviously be interesting to think about what they mean. I mean, it's surprising and interesting that real-world research, say in truly economic situations like in business research, that people find similar results, at least qualitatively, that certain amounts of generosity, but bounded generosity, prevail.
Well, I want to finish up by making a few of those connections, and the way I like to think about evolutionary game theory in contrast to classical game theory is that the strategies, because they're playing all combinations, any given strategy is playing itself part of the time, the other strategy part of the time, and so on. And so against that background, if we imagine a generous strategy at a low frequency, so that it's primarily playing the other strategy, then from the other strategy's perspective, it's primarily playing itself, right? Mm-hmm. And so the fact that your generous strategy is invisible is more or less telling me that in a mixed pair, that the mutant strategy, the generous strategy, is doing better than the extortionist strategy playing itself. Am I right about that?
Right. So, I mean, yeah. So basically, the generous strategy does well against itself, and it tends to, the difference between a generous strategy's score and its opponent's score tends to be as small as possible. So that's why it's able to invade, that it does well against itself and it minimizes the difference between its score and its opponent's score. So yeah, it's able to invade, depending on which generous strategy you pick, we find that it can invade sometimes upwards of 90% of all other IPD strategies successfully.
Whereas 0% of other IPD strategies can invade it selectively. Right. So there's two results here. One is whether or not it is invadable, and the main proof here is that these particular generous strategies cannot be invaded by anything selectively. But it also is true that, and this is just fortunate, I think, these generous strategies are very good at invading a huge diversity, a large proportion of all of the other IPD strategies. And so that's why we would think that evolution would actually tend towards these generous strategies, in the sense that they can not only not only are they robust once they're established, but they're likely to establish because they're actually able to invade less generous strategies for almost all the time.
And that does not require, almost by definition, the gender strategy playing itself, because at a low frequency, that's precisely what's not happening.
Right.
So the gender strategy has to be successful enough in playing an extortionist strategy to outperform the extortionists playing each other. Is that right?
As an invader, yes. But once the generous strategy is resident, how it does against itself is really quite important.
Right. But then, I mean, that's where I think it's at some point it's important to basically alter some of the assumptions, because we know there's real world situations in which being a cooperator is sufficiently sacrificial that unless you actually get cooperator interactions, then it's not going to go, because in a mixed pair the cooperator is too much at a disadvantage, right?
Right. I mean, I guess I view what we're talking about is like as quantifying how much of a disadvantage you can get away with by being a cooperator and still succeed. So yeah, like if you're a naive cooperator, then you're always going to get in trouble. And if you play tit for tat, for example, then that doesn't work either. You've got to sort of play something in between. And yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I guess it is important to mention that the basic idea of our results, has been around for decades. There's famous sort of individual strategies such as tit for tat, and even generous tit for tat, which is a little bit more forgiving,
Right.
That have been known to do very well in evolutionary settings in this sort of idealized prisoner's dilemma game. And in many ways, well, in a word, our analysis is sort of is to provide a principled version of tit for tat. And indeed, we can define precisely how tit for tatty you have to be if you're going to behave well or do well in evolution. And it turns out that in fact, strict tit for tat or even strict generous tit for tat are not evolutionary robust. So we can find strategies that do better than them. And again, we find them in a principled way that relies on this result of Press and Dyson.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. So then as we try to expand upon that, what would happen if with an n-person game theory with groups larger than 2? I know that you don't know, but what's the
Well, you're asking us to hazard guesses, which is something that we're not accustomed to doing, obviously. In this.
I've never guessed anything.
Oh, we've never guessed, right? We're not psychologists. So, yes. Well, there's at least 2 questions there. Even in the 2-player evolutionary game theory, where the interactions are always pairwise, although there's sums across pairs, one question is what you mentioned before: what if there's a finite time horizon, and how would things behave? And I think I think that you're right, Alex. In some sense, that sort of is like playing in a slightly more stochastic and smaller population. And so we should mention that the smaller the population, you have to be a little bit less forgiving and a little bit less generous to be robust. So with finite time horizons in 2-player settings, I think that my intuition would be that lots of these results hold, but the quantitative regions where you can be generous are going to be shrunken a little bit. But in truly multiplayer interactions where your success isn't just the sum of your pairwise success across all the other members in the population, but rather depends combinatorially on what everyone else is doing. Not only don't I have any intuition, but I'm not sure I even know what a good definition of generosity would mean in that multifactorial setting. Do you?
Well, not off the top of my head. No, I haven't.
I've only really.
You could. I guess you'd be thinking maybe about like tag-based strategies where you play one strategy against someone with the same tag as you, but a different strategy against someone else, and then generosity would be related to how you play against a different type or something.
But even harder is the question. I think that's what you're driving at, David. That what if what you play? I mean, the space of what you play, you're playing it against everyone simultaneously, right? I mean, your payoff depends on what everyone is playing simultaneously, right? And is that the concern you have? That is a real world concern. That's not an address.
No, I mean, there's a result from Boyd and Richardson, I think, that if you just play the prisoner's dilemma in groups of size n, then it's much harder for tit for tat to get established because of mutation frequency. You have a bunch of groups of size n, and then one group has one tit for tat, and what's the strategy? Do you defect if unless everyone else in the group cooperates? What is a tit-for-tat strategy in a group of size n? You have to make decisions along those lines. But whatever it is, it's harder for tit-for-tat to invade in large n than with n equals 2. So it goes on like that. I mean, it's a huge parameter space, so I'm not asking you to explore the whole parameter space. But of course, as we want to apply this, of course, so many interactions do take place in larger groups. So although the result is wonderful and I love it, it's and it's a nice heartwarming message, right? That cooperation wins the day. We know that in real life there's a mix of cooperative and defecting strategies. So we know that there's a niche for defection out there, and so we just want to explore more of the parameter space. But,
well, let me just clarify one little thing, just to make sure that we're on the exact same wavelength here. I think we are, actually, but in our analysis, it's true that all of the plays are pairwise. Each player plays against one other player in the population, sums up his total payoff, and that determines how well he does in the next generation. But interestingly, although it's not really an n-player interaction, the size of the population has an impact on how generous you can be and still be robust. In other words, and this is actually a little bit it still is a little bit surprising to me, that in the larger the population is, the more generous you can be and yet be evolutionary robust in the two-player interaction. So it's not about groups of size n, but rather the total population size getting larger.
When does that begin to plateau? At what sizes?
Oh, in our paper, even as big as 10, we get pretty big.
Well, certainly once you're bigger than 100,
yeah. Even by what I would call handful-sized groups, the bounds on your generosity are sort of set. But between 2 and, well, certainly 2, but between 3 and 10,
at 2, you're back to classical game theory.
Yeah, exactly. Between 3 and 10, there is some room for variation in how generous you can be and still be robust. Which is an interesting number. 10 is sort of a number that makes sense. Like, I mean, we can think about, our lab has a size that's sort of order 10, and I've heard the number 10 discussed in other situations too. The point is that it's not an astronomically large number. Where the point is that in the groups of that size or smaller, you have to think about how large the group is to figure out how generous you can be.
Yeah. And then there's other things which are not in your model which would weigh in favor of cooperation, especially partner choice, because to the degree that people choose their partners, then that's a huge force. And one well known to operate in humans. We did empirical research on basically how prosocial you are as an individual and the amount of social support you get, which is the prosociality of your social partners. And we found in real-world urban populations a correlation coefficient of 0.7. So there's huge non-random interactions which are not in your model, and if you were to put them in, of course, it would weigh very, very strongly in favor of these cooperative strategies. So the idea that cooperation is a successful evolutionary strategy, of course, is huge, and it's wonderful to know. I think the Preston-Dyson article was kind of interpreted to be a kind of an argument against that, and it's nice to know that your paper kind of restores the importance of cooperation, even based on their model.
Well, so a few comments. I mean, yes, I think that there are a lot of realistic things that would tip in large populations the balance for cooperation, and those are actually more easy to incorporate into our model. So the things that are might make cooperation a little bit more challenged in a large population, such as multi-way interactions, are much harder for us to really analyze, and therefore I really just don't have any intuition about. And finally, yes, it was true that Preston-Dyson's article was interpreted by others as sort of a negative view of cooperation, but I should hasten to add that Preston-Dyson were well aware that they're working in the confines of classical game theory, and in some sense we're writing a beautifully classical paper, and we're, I think, somehow misinterpreted as having a sort of grim view of cooperation writ large, when in fact they were just discussing two players. And even in the context of two players, there's a beautiful result that's sort of hidden in the Preston-Dyson paper, that if both players are aware of these extortionist strategies, and they both are aware that they're aware of them, and so on, they both are rational, they both have theory of minds that each of these players is a capable sentient being, then the sheer knowledge of these, the knowledge that each of them could extort the other, could choose to try to extort the other, might lead them to sort of a fair outcome where they divide payoffs fairly. So there's even in the two-player setting, although this is sort of a different theory, and it's almost more philosophical, Press and Dyson have a sort of silver lining that arises from their extortion strategies. Okay. So I think that there's something very, very clever going on there, even in the two-player setting.
And your admiration for their paper is clear. So, and that's really nice to know, basically, that you think that they made a great contribution. Now I want to end with a question, though, kind of challenging the justification for classical game theory, because if we think that these strategies do evolve from an evolutionary process in some sense, and life does consist of more than a single dyad, then as beautiful as classical game theory might be, how are its assumptions warranted? It seems to me that actually that's predicated upon mistaken assumptions, and that evolutionary game theory is preferable by virtue of its more realistic assumptions. What justifies classical game theory?
Well, hang on, you're asking about when it would be, what kind of situation classical game theory would actually be applicable to, or you're asking about the assumptions of rationality, or, sorry, I didn't quite follow that.
Well, I think he's asking sort of more the former, and I think so. And I mean, I think it's very much the biologist's view that evolutionary game theory has the upper hand, but I should point out that when it was first developed, in the 50s and so, there was a very important dyad that people had in mind, and where classical game theory makes a lot of sense. That's obviously the sort of Cold War dyad that the Rand Corporation was worried about. And in the context of who's going to destroy which country first, considering rationally a pair of players and disregarding their evolutionary history makes perfect sense to me. And I think a lot of very early classical game theory that ignored how strategies happened to get where they were and focused only on what are the outcomes and what can we expect our rational single partner out there to do, for the purposes that they were being developed, which was certainly Cold War purposes, makes perfect sense. If, however, you want to try to understand how people are going to behave in a market or sort of some sort of much more complex situation, then I do think that a strict dyadic theory of games is insufficient and indefensible.
Okay, you make a good point. There's a few situations in which there actually are only two players in the universe, and
there were,
and the Cold War was among them. So that's a very important point. But in most other situations, life consists of many groups, many dyads, and in that case, then there's something missing from classical game theory.
Yeah, I would say that, but also I would say that the people who call themselves game theorists, and we probably wouldn't, are certainly well aware of this. And game theory has evolved even within the economic literature to be very encompassing of and trying to embrace and understand conditions on evolutionary robustness and evolutionary success. So this gradual evolution of the theory itself from a sort of dyadic to an evolutionary theory, it has indeed occurred already, I think.
Yeah.
It's also surely worth saying that there's huge practical value to understanding the outcome of a game with just two players in it, as Press and Dyson's result shows. It's only because we can understand the relative scores of two players that we can then take that information and expand it to n players. But if you started from the complicated case, you might never get anywhere. So I think
that's a good point.
It's worth thinking about.
We certainly got it.
No.
So you need to understand the dynamics of a single group before you can understand the dynamics of a multi-group population. Right. And even the dynamic of a single dyad can be complicated when you're considering these various self-aware strategies and so on. So yeah, as a component of the problem, then that's absolutely true. Awesome. Well, I really hope that this very interesting discussion for me can be made available to a wider audience, and to take a look at the state of the art, basically, on the theory of cooperation.
Thanks very much, David.
Okay, so signing off for this view of life. Bye-bye.
Bye.